Hello, my name is Maria Priestley and this is submission number 87. I'm presenting today on behalf of myself and Elena Simperl. The title of our paper is Open Innovation Programs Related to Data and AI. How do the entrepreneurial orientations of startups align with the objectives of public funders? Our research sits in the context of European policy initiatives that aim to support the assimilation of data and AI technologies in society. There are a number of mechanisms that are being used to deliver this support. So this includes the creation of data ecosystems that support different stakeholders and different industry sectors to share and innovate with data. And there are also open innovation programs where different public and private stakeholders come together to exchange knowledge and to raise the innovation capacity of the participating organizations. Policymakers in particular have been keen to support best practices related to standardization and ethical data management as a means to support sustainable cooperation and trust between different stakeholders over the long term. And although these publicly funded initiatives have mainly been motivated by collective benefits, they tend to be targeted towards individual startups and SMEs because these are the stakeholders who have the greatest difficulty in accessing resources and specialist guidance related to data innovation. And also they tend to have more flexibility to innovate and introduce radical solutions into the economy. So in our study, we were interested in this demand-side perspective. So we asked the question of how do the objectives of startups and SMEs align with the collective vision of public funders. And the reason we wanted to ask that question is because innovation can take various different forms, and the costs and benefits of different innovation strategies can vary depending on whether we consider them from individual or collective levels. So this slide shows some examples of the innovation activities that are supported by the European Commission. And although each of them is beneficial at the collective level, they also have certain costs that are carried by the companies that implement them. For instance, standardization is something that can involve putting data into reusable formats or following common protocols. And we know that this is something that helps different stakeholders to reuse data sets or to reuse services created by other organizations. But implementing standardization in these contexts actually requires quite a lot of time and technical skills from the companies that deliver them. Another practice to consider is intellectual property rights. So this is something that's promoted by the European Commission as a means to incentivize companies to exchange their knowledge and to form partnerships. But at the same time, this actually poses a cost to the innovating companies because they need to cover the costs of legal advice and patenting fees, which can actually be quite substantial if you are a small innovator. And then finally, there's GDPR compliance, which is something that helps to build trust between the data subjects and other organizations who might like to reuse personal data. But again, this requires specialist expertise from the companies who are generating personal data. In order to help companies to overcome some of the specific challenges associated with data innovation, which I mentioned in the previous slide, the European Commission has been funding various acceleration and incubation programs. Our study focuses on one such program. It's called the Data Market Services Accelerator, or DMS for short. DMS was launched a couple of years ago. It's a 3-year program that's run by a consortium of 10 organizations, including business accelerators, dissemination managers, standardization bodies, and universities. And collectively, they provide training, mentoring, and networking opportunities to startups and SMEs who participate in the program. Each year, 50 companies are selected to draw on a catalog of services, which includes help with fundraising, acceleration, standards and legal promotion, and data skills. So in our study, we wanted to understand the objectives and motivations of the startups who were joining this program. And in order to do that, we analyzed the application forms which they submitted when they were first applying to participate in the program. And specifically, our sample includes the applications of 50 successful startups who came from different stages of maturity, different industry sectors, and different European countries. And in the lower part of this slide, you can see the various parts of the application forms that were included in our analysis. This includes written descriptions of, for instance, the data-driven focus of their business, their motivations to join the program, and their specific interest in the program's services. And in order to analyze the applications, we used a qualitative approach. We analyzed different parts of text inside the applications by categorizing them according to a multi-dimensional coding framework. And this included the various different service categories that are available at DMS Accelerator, and these are shown in the orange header. And we also categorized the written responses according to different themes that describes the entrepreneurial behaviors and attitudes of the startups, which are shown in the gray left-hand column. And this comprises of 3 categories, which are proactiveness, innovativeness, and risk-taking. And we chose these categories because they've previously been used in entrepreneurship literature to understand the characteristics of successful companies. So once we had this kind of matrix of different coding categories, we read through the startups' applications, and we recorded the specific topics that emerged at the intersection of the different service categories and entrepreneurial orientations. And in this slide, you can see a graphic showing what happened when we counted the number of references that were coded at the intersection between different DMS service categories and the 3 different entrepreneurial orientations. So in this bubble chart, the size of each circle corresponds to the number of references that were coded at each intersecting theme. What we can see here is that the most frequently discussed topics in startup applications were related to fundraising, acceleration, and data skills. And topics like GDPR, standardization, and IPR received relatively less interest. And then if we also look at the entrepreneurial orientations from the bottom axis, we can see that the responses were quite proactive in terms of anticipating the steps needed from the company to stay ahead of competitors. And then in the category of innovativeness, quite a lot of this is focused in the fundraising category. And this was because funding was frequently mentioned as a prerequisite to product development and innovation. And then in the dimension of risk, we can see that quite a lot of these references relate to GDPR. And this mainly came from companies who were conscious of the risks of working with personal data. And then we looked behind the emerging themes to get a better understanding about why the startups' priorities were distributed in the way that they were, and also to try and see how it might be possible to reconcile their interests with the kinds of services that the European Commission is especially keen to promote. So in the area of acceleration, we found that companies were interested in expanding into new markets, both in terms of geographies and also industry sectors. And they were interested in scaling their operation capabilities in those areas. With fundraising, quite a lot of companies wanted to invest in their operations, technology development, and marketing. And they also viewed funding as a prerequisite to some of the themes observed in the acceleration category. So they needed money in order to increase their geographic coverage, commercialization, and market fit. With data skills, many applicants wanted to improve their product to get a competitive advantage. And then finally, with promotion, they were interested in establishing business-to-business sales and marketing, especially to larger stakeholders like big corporations or public institutions. And here is an example of a 5-year vision shared by one of the companies, which captures a lot of the themes that I mentioned in the previous slide. So we can see they wanted to accelerate technology development and reach the global market faster, then through market validation and product market fit to build a longer sustainable growth model, and then finally to prepare battle-tested technology, core team, and international sales channels for scaling up. So this is quite an ambitious vision. And now we move on to the themes that were discussed less frequently. So in the case of GDPR, there were a number of companies who worked with personal data, and in general, they wanted to comply with data protection regulations. And some companies actually went beyond this and viewed data protection as an opportunity to establish their reputation and leadership in their market. And then in the case of standardization, we found that some of the companies wanted to use this as an opportunity to learn from other stakeholders in their market and to identify common benchmarks. And there were also a number of companies who wanted to build interoperable data platforms. But what was interesting there was that not all of the companies who wanted to build interoperable solutions indicated an interest in receiving help with standardization. And then finally, with intellectual property rights, there were a couple of themes that emerged here. Some companies were interested in learning about how IP can help to increase the value of their company in the eyes of investors. And others were more concerned about the actual practicalities of patenting software and AI technologies, because they are quite different to other kinds of innovations. And this slide shows some examples of the themes addressed in the previous slide. So we can see that the first company here viewed data standardization as a legal issue rather than something technical. And then in the second case, this company describes IP protection and GDPR compliance as something that will help them to compete in European markets. And then the last one needed support around data ownership and intellectual property rights in order to monetize their solutions and build new services, which is quite consistent with what the European Commission is trying to achieve. So overall, in our study, we learned that the startups were most interested in services related to fundraising and acceleration. And although these kinds of services don't necessarily make use of the specialized data expertise of publicly funded programs, these intentions were actually broadly aligned with publicly funded intentions. For instance, one of the reasons that companies wanted to raise their funds was in order to grow their team, which supports regional employment, which is good for public funders. And in the area of acceleration, companies were interested in expanding into new European markets and establishing collaborations or even data integrations with other businesses, which again resonates with the types of outcomes that the European Commission hopes to encourage through standardization and intellectual property. And then with the less popular services, we found that things like standardization, GDPR, and IPR received relatively less interest, but the answers that were provided under those themes revealed motivations that can actually be used to heighten the appeal of these services in publicly funded initiatives. And based on the findings of our study, we've come up with a few recommendations. So firstly, we would suggest using case studies and stories to clarify how specific best practices related to data innovation have been used in industry in the past. And we think that by presenting the experiences of other companies, these kinds of stories or case studies could help to appeal to the startup's desire to learn from others and to feel part of the European entrepreneurial community. And secondly, we would suggest relating the best practices to the startup's existing motivations, for instance, by presenting GDPR compliance as a way to build trust and leadership in their industry. And then standardization can be presented as a source of insider knowledge and networking opportunities, and also as something that's necessary for companies that wish to create interoperable data solutions or services. And then in regards to intellectual property, we suggest that this can be presented as something that can help companies to secure their market position and to signal the value of their company to investors. And then finally, we would recommend for innovation programs to utilize their administrative data, such as the participants' applications, which was used in our case. And this can help to monitor the changing needs and experiences of startups who participate in these publicly funded initiatives. And ultimately, that can help to tailor the service offerings in order to make sure that the participants can get the most value out of those services. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I look forward to answering some of your questions during the conference. Thank you very much. Bye.